This is what happened when pressure turned into force. Sanctions became blockades, warnings became military action, and a sitting president was taken into U.S. custody.
The United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation.
In just months, U.S.-Venezuela tensions rewrote the balance of power in the region. This is the full story, based only on verified facts. These are the events that turned long-running U.S.-Venezuela tensions.
And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II.
Into open military signals and global controversy. This video explains what happened when it happened, who was involved, and what the latest developments actually mean, using verified facts only. For decades, the relationship between the United States and Venezuela stayed tense, but contained. Yet between 2025 and early 2026, that tension shifted sharply into military action, airspace restrictions, and widespread international reaction. What follows breaks down the background, the step-by-step escalation, the military and political signals, and the current situation, separating what actually happened from assumptions that never held up. Strained relations between Washington and Caracas stretch back to the late 1990s, tightening after Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, and continuing under Nicolás Maduro without meaningful recovery. U.S. officials repeatedly accused Venezuela's leadership of authoritarian rule, corruption, and ties to drug trafficking, which meant Venezuelan leaders and their allies pushed back by accusing the United States of economic warfare and violations of national sovereignty. By the 2010s, that back-and-forth hardened into formal economic sanctions, aimed heavily at Venezuela's oil industry, and especially at the state-owned company Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., better known as PDVSA. That hostile baseline mattered, because when events accelerated in 2025 and 2026, they grew out of an already confrontational status quo rather than a sudden policy shift. Pressure turned into action during 2025, and that change became impossible to ignore. August 8, 2025 marked a clear line when President Donald Trump authorized the Pentagon to use military force against Latin American drug cartels and raised the reward for Nicolás Maduro's capture to $50 million. 1 month later, September 2025 brought lethal maritime strikes by U.S. forces against vessels accused of drug trafficking near Venezuelan waters, and according to reports cited by Britannica, those operations left at least 95 people dead. What nobody missed was the location, because this represented one of the first times U.S. military force intersected directly with Venezuela's coastal region in a deadly way. Early October 2025 introduced open military signaling when Venezuela accused the United States of provocation along its coast. Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez stated that 5 U.S. fighter jets had been detected near Venezuelan airspace, which meant Caracas responded by raising its military readiness rather than de-escalating. November 2025 brought a visible shift inside Venezuela as the Maduro government elevated the national military alert level and launched nationwide exercises known as the Superior Phase of Independence Plan 200. Those drills prepared all branches of the armed forces for full operational readiness, and at the same time U.S. naval pressure increased across the Caribbean. The escalation sharpened on November 29, 2025, when President Trump publicly declared Venezuelan airspace effectively closed, citing rising security risks tied to the standoff. Military moves ran alongside economic force, and neither side treated them separately. December 10, 2025 brought the seizure of an oil tanker named Skipper by U.S. forces off Venezuela's coast, which signaled that maritime pressure had become operational. Days later, December 16 and 17, the United States announced a naval blockade targeting Venezuelan oil tankers under Operation Southern Spear, tightening control over oil shipments. By December 31, 2025, Washington added new sanctions against 4 Venezuelan oil companies and 4 oil tankers, with the U.S. Treasury stating that the goal was to cut off revenue linked to Maduro's government. For Venezuela, where oil exports underpin economic survival, the impact of those measures landed hard and fast. Early January 2026 pushed the confrontation into territory few expected. January 3 brought a direct U.S. military operation inside Venezuela that resulted in the capture of Nicolás Maduro, an action that immediately rewrote the scale of the conflict. Maduro was flown to New York and now faces federal charges in U.S. court, which made the arrest of a sitting head of state by a foreign military power impossible to dismiss or downplay. The result was immediate shock, both inside the region and far beyond it. Global reactions followed within days, and they arrived from every direction. Cuba announced that 32 Cuban officers were killed during the U.S. operation, according to Associated Press reports, and President Miguel Diaz-Canel publicly mourned the deaths while condemning U.S. actions. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva added regional weight by stating that the United States had crossed an unacceptable line, signaling strong opposition from Latin America's largest country. At the United Nations, Venezuelan representatives described the operation as a gigantic crime of aggression, while UN officials warned that tensions in the southern Caribbean were rising fast. Inside the United States, criticism also surfaced, and reporting from The Guardian showed some lawmakers questioning whether the operation exceeded existing war powers' authority. Maduro's capture reshaped leadership in Caracas almost immediately. Delcy Rodriguez stepped into the role of acting leader, and on January 5, 2026, she publicly called for diplomatic collaboration with the U.S. government while rejecting what she described as interventionist tactics. That same period saw the Federal Aviation Administration impose a commercial flight ban over Venezuelan airspace, a rare move driven by security concerns that signaled continued instability. Reports during this window also pointed to GPS jamming and electronic warfare activity in parts of the Caribbean, adding a technological layer to an already complex confrontation. Two competing explanations now sit at the center of this conflict. From Washington's perspective, these actions fall under a broader counter-narcotics and anti-narco-terrorism campaign, with sanctions, seizures, and military force framed as necessary tools to disrupt criminal networks. Venezuela and its allies tell a very different story, describing the same actions as violations of sovereignty, economic strangulation, and illegal use of force under international law. Those narratives now play out across media coverage, diplomatic meetings, and international institutions rather than behind closed doors. As of January 5, 2026, several facts define the situation. Nicolás Maduro remains in U.S. custody in New York. Venezuela operates under acting leadership. Sanctions and travel restrictions stay in place, and international debate continues at the United Nations. This is no longer an abstract dispute or a war of statements, because military, economic, and diplomatic consequences are already in motion. This video set out to explain how U.S.-Venezuela tensions escalated into direct military action, and what the latest developments actually mean. The record shows a chain of decisions, starting with sanctions and naval pressure, and moving through open military intervention and global reaction rather than a single breaking point. Where this confrontation goes next remains uncertain. Yet the events of 2025 and early 2026 have already reshaped the relationship between the United States, Venezuela, and much of Latin America. That reality makes a clear understanding of the facts more necessary than speculation.